Thank you for joining us, both in person and our live stream camera up in the corner. We're here at the Forbes Library in the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Library and Museum. If this is your first time in this space, please do feel free to walk around, see some sights while you're here, and also come back during our museum open hours. We often have volunteer docents who can show you more around at the room, tell you a little bit about President Coolidge's legacy. For those of you in this space, thank you for being here. I know it's hard to leave your home on a dark, dreary day like today. Just to orient you to the room, we are on the second floor of the building. If you need a bathroom or water fountain, those are across the way through the gallery, and take a left. There's 2 restrooms and a water fountain there. The elevator and the stairwell are both that away. One of those you probably came up to get here. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you for joining us. The live stream will be running tonight during the event, and then we will have it posted as a regular video that lives on our YouTube channel later tomorrow, most likely. So if you'd like to revisit this, or if you end up watching a little bit and can't finish it, please do come back and watch. And if you have any questions lingering after the event, feel free to get in touch with us and we can pass them on to our presenters here. Otherwise, I think that's pretty much it. During the Q&A at the end, I'll ask that you please raise your hand and I'll run around with the microphone so that we can all hear you, both those of us in the room and those of us watching online, because the microphone fuels into the live stream. And also with that, I'll ask you all to please turn your phones off if you can, or the volume. With that, I will let you all know that the camera is focused on the podium for now. And when we're ready for Q&A, we'll pass it back over here. Come on up. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Priya. She's the librarian for adult services here at Forbes. I think I got that right? Yes. Oh, good. And I was going to announce this a little bit later in my intro, but somebody's phone just went ringing off, so let's do it right now. Could you please mute your devices, which would be great if you haven't done so already. So I'm John Berkowitz, and welcome to this community forum titled Ending the Ukraine War, What Should U.S. Policy Be in 2025? But first, let us acknowledge that we are here tonight for this event in this library, on this land that was lived on and cared for millennia by the Nipmuc and Pocumtuck peoples. They never sold or gave this land willingly to white settler colonists ever since 1620. And the descendants of these indigenous people continue to live here and consider these lands and waters as sacred gifts to be honored and protected. If we could just take one breath and a moment of silence for that land acknowledgement. Thank you. This program is hosted and sponsored by both Forbes Library of Northampton and the statewide organization Massachusetts Peace Action, based in Boston. We're also grateful that Forbes is live streaming this event on its YouTube channel, as Priya just said, making the program accessible to many more people in our community, around the state, and beyond. We'd like to note that during this live streaming, audience members who are in this room and want to speak during the question and answer part of the program will not be on camera and therefore will remain anonymous. The forum will end at 5 minutes before 8 p.m. when the library closes, and we're going to make an effort to pack everything up and really be out of here by 10 past 8, because library staff like to leave at 8 o'clock, and they're stretching a little bit for us. This is the third public forum on the Ukraine war that Forbes Library has hosted in the past 14 months. Our presenters tonight are myself and John Feffer for the third time, the two of us for the third time, and Benjamin Abelo for the first. We will speak during the first part of the program, offering our generally opposing views on this critical foreign policy issue. We'll each take a 6-minute turn, followed by another round of 6 minutes each to add any further remarks and respond to each other's viewpoints. John Feffer will have 2 6-minute turns in each round, since he is speaking generally in favor of current U.S. policy, whereas both myself and Ben Abelo are speaking against it. I will just say, 14 months ago, the first forum, there were 4 panelists, 4 speakers, and kind of 2 each on both sides of the issue, but we're not able to find a 4th speaker speaking from the viewpoint of favoring U.S. policy. So that's why John, the other John, has that second 6-minute round in each round. I live in Northampton, and I am a retired but still active activist for peace, economic and racial justice, and environmental protection. John Feffer of Amherst is the author of several books and the director of director of the program Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Ben Abelo published in 2022 the book How the West Brought War to Ukraine, Understanding How U.S. and NATO Policies Led to Crisis, War, and the Risk of Nuclear Catastrophe. Each of us will address such questions as, should the U.S. continue arming and supporting Ukraine to defend its sovereignty, protect its democracy, and defeat Russia? Should the U.S. urge Ukraine to negotiate a settlement before it risks even greater losses of soldiers, territory, and infrastructure, and risks escalating the war into an even more lethal confrontation between the U.S. and NATO and Russia, which could spiral out of control into a catastrophic nuclear war? And what are the origins of this war and their impact on U.S. policy going forward? During the second part of the program, audience members will be welcome to ask us questions and offer their comments about their own views, to which we'll briefly respond. Each audience member will have a time limit of 45 seconds so that we can hear from as many people as possible. And lastly, if you'd like to take home a paper copy of our presentations, these will be available on the table at the door as you leave. Actually, they're right here, right now, at least mine. For our live stream viewers, you can find this information on the Massachusetts Peace Action website under the Ukraine section or tab. Priya has already mentioned for the live audience where the bathrooms are located. Please feel free anytime to find them. And without further ado, let us begin this discussion with presentations by each of us. We'll start with John Feffer from Amherst.
John, and thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here for the third time. It seems as though many factors are contributing to what seems to be a push at the moment toward a ceasefire. What are those factors? Well, Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky has said that he is open to compromise, to trading land for peace. Vladimir Putin, well, the Russian economy is definitely in perilous condition. We've seen that the sanctions are starting to bite. We have 9% inflation rate in Russia. We have a 21% interest rate. They're running low on soldiers, as are the Ukrainians. The Russians are obviously in need of other soldiers. They brought in 10,000 North Koreans. They have emptied their prisons, basically, by conscripting labor from those prisoners. They have basically offered the equivalent of $22,000 for sign-up bonuses, and they fooled Yemenis and Indians into fighting their war in Ukraine. So obviously they need folks to fight this war. They're running out of folks. So it's likely that they too, perhaps, are more interested in compromise. And then, of course, we have Donald Trump, who has said that he will end the war on day one. How he'll do that? Well, not exactly sure, but we'll go into that in some detail. But what I'd like to point out to you in this first presentation is this is not as it seems. I've given you suggestion that things seem to be converging towards peace, ceasefire, some kind of end in the conflict, but that's not actually the case. Let's start with Russia. Russia actually, under Vladimir Putin, has no interest in negotiating right now. Russia has been gaining ground in November, 11 square miles per day, in its attempt to beat back the Ukrainians, especially in the Donbass region. The maximalist position of the Putin administration remains. It wants to, quote unquote, denazify Ukraine, that is, replace its administration with a Kremlin-friendly political arrangement, and it wants to disarm the country. In other words, remove it from being any kind of potential threat in the future. And in terms of how it has responded to what the Trump administration has said, that may be its plan, its concept of a plan for ending the war, let me just quote to you from Konstantin Malofeyev. Malofeyev is an oligarch, a very close confidant of Putin. When he speaks, he's often saying in an unvarnished way what the Kremlin is really thinking. Malofeyev said to the Financial Times, Keith Kellogg is Trump's envoy to Russia and Ukraine, Keith Kellogg comes to Moscow with his plan. We take it and then tell him to screw himself because we don't like any of it. That'd be the whole negotiation. So that's basically Russia's kind of perspective right now about ceasefire and negotiations. What about Ukraine? I said that Zelensky is interested in compromise, maybe trading land for peace, but there's a catch there. Land for peace plus membership in NATO. Problem is, NATO membership is not forthcoming. Biden administration was not interested in providing it, and certainly the Trump administration is not interested. In fact, it may not even be possible to offer any membership in NATO if Donald Trump follows through on his threat of removing the United States from NATO. In addition, Zelensky is getting $1 billion in military assistance from the Biden administration that was just announced, a $50 billion loan that's collateralized on the interest of Russian assets frozen in the West, $20 billion of which was provided by the Biden administration today. And the Ukrainians are considering lowering the conscription age from 25 to 18. In other words, the major reason why Zelensky has talked about trading land for peace is because they don't have enough soldiers. They don't think that they can really defend Ukraine effectively. But if they lower the conscription age from 25 to 18, they'll have a shot, perhaps, of holding the line. In other words, Russia is not interested in negotiating because it thinks it can still seize more land. Ukraine is not interested in negotiating because they're getting more assistance as we speak, and it's a fight for survival for them. And I'll talk about that in the second part a little bit. And then what about Trump? He said he's going to end the war on day one. But what does that mean exactly? Does that mean actually ending U.S. assistance to Ukraine? Probably not. This is what Keith Kellogg, his envoy, said in testimony to the Senate last year. A war born in American weakness can only be ended by American strength. That's why the path to bringing these negotiations about is to enable Ukraine to defeat the Russian army in Ukraine and provide Ukraine with the military armament it needs to do so. This is Trump's envoy on this issue. What is Kellogg's plan? To threaten Ukraine with a removal of aid if it doesn't come to the negotiating table, threaten Russia with providing Ukraine with more aid if it doesn't come to the negotiating table. But as I've explained, neither side at this point is particularly interested in negotiating. So these threats are not likely to be effective. Let me just finish by saying that, as Augustine said about abstinence, he said, give me abstinence, but not yet, because of course he still wanted to sow his wild oats. The suggestion right now is peace, but probably not yet. The kind of peace that is imagined by Donald Trump, perhaps and certainly by Vladimir Putin, is not a just peace. It is the peace of occupation, the peace of the cemetery, the peace, and I think it's always ironic to have a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this, because what happened to the Native Americans? They were occupied, and they were defeated militarily, and they were exterminated, and that is what Ukraine faces today, and that's why we have to defend them, and that's why I support defending them. Thank you.
Thanks, John. What I'd like to share is that I'm here tonight to say that I am deeply concerned, even alarmed, by the recent escalation of the war in Ukraine. I think it's urgent to stop it through immediate negotiations because the risks are too great to let it continue. Not only for the Ukrainians to end the destruction of their country and the tremendous loss of life and territory they've already suffered, but also potentially for the whole world in terms of two overarching threats facing not just Ukraine and Russia, but all of humanity: the climate emergency and nuclear war. First, the climate emergency. The longer this war goes on, the more carbon gets burned up by the huge military use of oil, gas, and coal on land, sea, and air, and by the destruction in 2022 of Russia's Nord Stream gas pipeline through the Baltic Sea to Europe, which led to the largest one-time leak of methane gas in history, methane being 80 times, I believe, more powerful than carbon dioxide going up in the atmosphere, and by the lack of urgently needed international cooperation to deal with the worsening climate crisis. There's also the risk of an attack on any of the Ukrainian nuclear power plants, especially the one in Zaporizhia, which is the largest one in Europe and which is now under Russian control. Such a meltdown would be catastrophic, far more so than the Chernobyl one 40 years ago. There have already been too many close calls with shelling near the plant by the Ukrainians. And second, the threat of nuclear war. If current trends on the battlefield continue, Ukrainian troops may have to retreat further west, even as far as the Dnieper River, which would mean losing nearly half of their country's territory. The US and NATO may then decide to help Ukraine avoid such a defeat by, one, sending in American so-called advisors and or French, British, Polish, Romanian troops. Two, allowing Ukraine to continue using British and longer range, allowing Ukraine to continue firing US and British long-range missiles that can attack targets deep inside Russia. These missiles are actually operated by US and British personnel on the ground in Ukraine and at European bases. This crossed a big red line for Russia, which responded a month ago with an attack on a Ukrainian munitions factory using a new powerful missile that cannot be shot down. And three, allowing Ukraine to attack for the second time this year Russia's long-range radar sites that provide early warning of a nuclear attack. It's generally believed that these Russian radar stations are fewer and more inferior to American ones, so it could lead to a false alarm of an attack and an accidental launch of their weapons in response. Any or all of these would be a dangerous escalation of the conflict, leading to a direct military confrontation between the US, NATO, and Russia. Both sides are armed with nuclear weapons, and Russia has indicated that it would consider using them if they were attacked and threatened with defeat by such non-Ukrainian forces and weapons. Just like many policies and leaders of my own nation and government, I question and oppose Russian ones too. But I think we must stop vilifying and demonizing them and start talking to and negotiating with them. Did the Russians stop talking to and negotiating with us after we illegally invaded Iraq? We effectively negotiated with the Russians for the 45 years of the Cold War, and then, since 1990, to at least limit, if not eliminate, nuclear weapons. But President George W. Bush pulled out of the anti-ballistic ABM treaty in 2003. Trump abandoned the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF Treaty, in 2018, and the Open Skies Treaty in 2020. And Biden has done nothing to advance the most important one for the last 40 years, the START, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is set to expire in February of 2026. One of the voices sounding the alarm is George Beebe in his July 1st Time magazine article titled "The Coming Russian Escalation with the West." He's a former director of Russia analysis at the CIA, author of the book The Russia Trap: How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe. and now works for the Quincy Institute of Responsible Statecraft in Boston. He makes an urgent case for us to right-size the Russian threat to Europe and the U.S., not exaggerate it. I also want to urge our attenders and our viewers to look up the following other experts who are equally concerned about U.S. policy toward Ukraine. Two are also at the Quincy Institute. Anatol Levin, longtime professor, journalist, and author of a recent article in The Nation magazine called The Ukraine War, Compromise or Collapse? And James Webb, a third-generation U.S. Marine and former defense policy advisor to a senator and to the Senate Foreign Relations and Military Affairs Committee. Then there's Ted Postel, a top MIT professor of nuclear weapons and international security and former advisor to the Pentagon. He's been speaking out strongly about the great danger of the Ukrainian attack on Russia's early warning radar that I mentioned a bit earlier, and more recently about Russia's response to Ukraine's firing our long-range missiles into Russia. Finally, I'll also add Professor Nikolai Petro of the University of Rhode Island, whose recent book is titled The Tragedy of Ukraine: What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution. His family left the Soviet Union in the 1950s, and he has taught in and visited Ukraine repeatedly in the last 12 years. And last but not least, Jack Matlock, the career diplomat and U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1990 as the Soviet Union was collapsing. He asserts that Gorbachev was given high-level assurances that NATO would not be expanded into Eastern Europe, close to Russia's borders. Thank you. We'll now move back to John Feffer for his second 6-minute turn, and then after that will be Ben Abelo.
Hi again. Thanks for bringing me back onto the podium, and I apologize for not being able to find a second person to articulate these positions, but nonetheless, you get to hear me twice. What do these folks want? I'm going to talk a little bit about Russia, Ukraine, and of course, Donald Trump. I'm not interested really so much in what took place over the summer. We're in a different political environment now. We have to deal with the current situation. So let's talk about what Russia wants. And let's talk about right-sizing the Russian threat. I'm going to tell you exactly what Russia wants. I'm not going to minimize it. I'm not going to maximize it. I'm going to tell you what Vladimir Putin says and what he wants. First of all, as I said, Russia wants to destroy Ukraine. It doesn't believe that Ukraine exists as a nation or as a culture. It talks about denazifying it, even though there are really no Nazis at all in the Ukrainian government, and it's led by a Jewish politician. He wants to disarm Ukraine, in other words, eliminate its capacity to defend itself. He wants to paralyze the country, to make it incapable of existing as a nation in the international community. This is part of a general strategy that Russia, under Putin, has had toward what it calls the near abroad. In other words, the countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union that ring Russia today. It's very easy to see what the strategy is. There are only two options if you're in the near abroad. You're either a puppet of the Russian government, as Lukashenko is in Belarus, or you are in a frozen conflict. A frozen conflict is basically a conflict where Russia has intervened militarily and ensured that the territorial integrity of the country is compromised. That's a situation for Georgia, that's a situation for Moldova, and that is increasingly the situation for Ukraine. But it doesn't stop there. Putin has a strategy that goes far beyond just his near abroad. He's interested, of course, in undermining the European Union. Why else would he invest so much into putting into place far right-wing, essentially fascist leaders throughout Europe? We saw the intervention in Romania recently. The Romanian Supreme Court basically had to overturn the recent election because of Russian interference. But it wasn't just there. Russia tried to buy the election in Moldova by giving voters amounts of money to vote for the pro-Russian candidate. It has intervened in Georgia to ensure that the Georgia Dream government be pro-Russian as possible. This is its strategy. It has funneled money into far-right political formations in Western Europe as well: Germany, Austria, Netherlands, France. Okay, so that's Russia's territorial / ideological ambition. It wants to create a illiberal axis that is opposed to international law, democracy, and human rights. I can go into detail if there are questions, for instance, about his views on religion, family, and LGBT rights, but for the moment, I don't have that time. What does Ukraine want? Well, territory to ensure that its country is, unitary. Well, yes, but underlying that is survival. Not only the survival of the country as a country, the survival of the culture as a culture, but the people are fighting so that they do not have to live under occupation. Occupation is not theoretical. People in Ukraine know exactly what life under occupation looks like, because all they have to do is see what the situation is in the Russian-occupied territories, for instance, the Donbass. And what is that experience? That is the experience of imprisonment, censorship, and extrajudicial murder. Folks in Ukraine are concerned that what happened in Bucha, war crimes committed by Russian soldiers, will happen to them if Russian soldiers take over their territory. In essence, Ukraine believes that it will be safer for it to be a real country in the European Union and, if it can get it, NATO as well. Okay, what about Trump? What does Trump want and all about? Well, it's hard to know what Trump wants beyond everything being about him and loyalty to him and his legacy and his power. So it could go either way, as we've seen in his first administration when, for instance, he threatened to blow up North Korea and then ended up meeting with Kim Jong-un 3 times. The guy can go either way. But what we can say is he has an agenda that is as illiberal, well, getting close to as illiberal, as Vladimir Putin's. A contempt for international law, a contempt for democracy, a contempt for human rights. I suspect that Putin is delighted that Trump has been elected because he can play Trump very easily. He knows what happened in Afghanistan when Trump was negotiating with the Taliban. He knows that in his eagerness to get a deal, Trump basically signed what H.R. McMaster called a surrender accord. That's what Putin is waiting for Trump to do, to sell Ukraine down the river. It's basically, now that Trump is in office, up to Europe. It's up to Europe to defend these values of democracy, international law, and human rights. It's up to Europe to fight for a just peace. And that ultimately, again, is what I support, a just peace. Not any old peace, not the peace of a cemetery, not the peace of a morgue, but a just peace, where the people of Ukraine live without fear of imprisonment and death. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first, thanks for the library and for Massachusetts Peace Action, John, for organizing this, and for Deborah Andrew, who's selling my book outside. Let me just start by saying that, the narrative that John is presenting is pretty much the narrative we've been hearing for the last 3 years from not just our government, but from all the media, both in the U.S. and Europe, of course, from NATO, European leaders, European media. The media blackout in Europe is even worse than it is here. We've really not been presented accurate information. So my point here is to simply say that if you're undecided about this issue, or if you're starting off in a position similar to what John presented, I don't think in the 12 minutes I have I'm going to, lock you into the opposite position. So what I would recommend if you want to go further is you're welcome to get my book. It usually sells for $10 on Amazon, but you're welcome to just pay a couple of bucks as a small donation, or even just ask Deborah for it for nothing, and it's fine. Also, I'll give you my email address. If you approach me afterward, I can send you a PDF of the book, no charge, and you're welcome to circulate that if you wish as well. So, you know, I'm not going to respond in detail to things John said, but I'll just say that they're not accurate. The idea that Russia wanted to destroy Ukraine, it's just not accurate. If you look at the force structure, if you look at the nature of the bombing, you look at the collateral damage compared to military damage, none of it comports with the image that John is presenting. To give one simple example, the U.S. dropped more bombs on Baghdad in one day than Putin dropped in all of Ukraine in 30 days. There was a much higher targeting going on. There was a very specific purpose that had to do with what we called extension of diplomacy by other means, coercive diplomacy. And the intention was to get a neutral Ukraine. And I'll say more about that during my second period in the second round. But I just want to start by saying that. So what are we really dealing with here? We're dealing here with two different narratives or framings of events. One is the one essentially that John has presented, John Feffer presented, which is that Putin is essentially the new Hitler, the new Stalin, the new Tsar, that he's an imperialist, that he wants to expand Russian territory, that he wants Lebensraum, that he's trying to take over or destroy Ukraine, and then from there he'll extend further into Eastern Europe, and we better stop this Hitler right now. That's one narrative. The other narrative, which is widely condemned in the press and that you usually hear described as Putin's, Putin's puppet, are the people that say this, or they're actually in Putin's pocket, they're dupes of the Kremlin. And this is the view that sometimes it's actually a more complex view, but the main item has to do with the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, right to and toward and to Russia's borders. And the evidence is overwhelming that, in fact, Putin was responding to what he perceived to be an actual existential threat to Russia by the largest and most powerful military alliance that's existed in the history of the world. That's NATO. To us, NATO looks very benign, but it's not, from Russian eyes, a benign entity. So what we're really dealing with here is a question of which narrative is correct. And it's very important that we get a correct understanding of which narrative is correct, because actions follow from the narrative. And if you have the wrong narrative to start with, you're going to take the wrong actions, you're going to be basing all the wrong, you're going to be basing your approach on all the wrong suppositions and taking all the wrong actions. My undergraduate work is in history, but my graduate work, whatever you want to call it, is in medicine. So I kind of fall back on this medical cliche, which is that if you have the wrong diagnosis, you're going to do the wrong treatment and you may kill the patient. And in this case, the diagnosis, the model that is being worked with in the West is completely wrong, and as a result, Ukraine is being destroyed. Estimates are as high as 600,000 deaths, probably 100,000 amputees. The numbers of Russians are lower, significantly lower, but still significant. And you know that because of the fact that the artillery exchange ratio has been anywhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 in favor of Russia having more artillery available to attack. And most of the deaths in this war of attrition have occurred through artillery. So although both sides are actively concealing the actual deaths, and forget about what Zelensky just said about 60,000 or 40,000, he hasn't told the truth about anything since the start of the war, and there's no reason he should tell the truth about this. But any case, Ukraine is being destroyed. It's going to be destroyed further. We're putting the West at the risk of nuclear war. I'm going to my timer doesn't work here, but I'm going to just read a quote that will be useful as a starting point. So many of you may know the name Jens Stoltenberg, who was the Secretary General of NATO, which is the senior position of NATO, with either the first or second senior position, depending on how you crack it out. It's basically the president of the NATO alliance minus the commander-in-chief status. This is what Stoltenberg said last September, speaking to the European Parliament Committee of Foreign Affairs. And in this talk, he was gloating about the entry of Finland and Sweden, which Finland had joined, Sweden was in the process of joining, and he was gloating about this. And you know, the lesson that anyone should take from this is don't gloat, because you say things you don't want to say that are stupid and that are going to run against your position. He did what the American economist Jeffrey Sachs called the Washington gaffe, which is accidentally blurting out the truth. So I'm going to read you a piece from Stoltenberg's talk to the European Parliament's Committee on Foreign Affairs, and I probably have to stop let me just finish this one passage. It is historic that now Finland is a member of the alliance, and we have to remember the background. The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021 and actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us, and was a precondition for not invading Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his border. He got the exact opposite. He has got more NATO presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and he has also seen that Finland has already joined the alliance and Sweden will soon be a full member. This is good for the Nordic countries. It's good for Finland and Sweden, and it's also good for NATO. And it demonstrates that when President Putin invaded a European country to prevent more NATO, he's getting the exact opposite. That's what you call a Washington gaffe, carried out by a person in Washington or a person who's effectively under the control of Washington, which NATO is the dominant and controlling nation. Anyway, I assume I'm out of time here. So let me leave it at that. I'll have another 6 minutes. I'll bring a few more quotes that support the position that I think is the correct one, which is the one I'm arguing for. And then, you know, there'll be some discussion afterward, Q&A.
Thanks so much, Ben. That is the first round. Thank you for, hope it whetted your appetite, and I hope it's generating questions or your comments, you know, based on what you've heard, our viewpoints. But then we're going to, as advertised, we're going to go at it again and try to go a little deeper with our own perspectives, our own views, and perhaps begin to respond to what we've heard from one another as well. So this is the beginning of the second round. When that's done, the rest of the evening is Q&A when we get to there. So we'll start again with John Feffer.
Nice to be back. Benjamin, I would like you to believe that I have been parroting what the mainstream media has been saying for the last 3 years. The inconvenient fact of the matter is that I work for a progressive think tank in Washington, D.C., the Institute for Policy Studies. I work daily on a critique of U.S. foreign policy, and I've done so for the last 15 years. In 1997, I began writing about NATO and about Eastern Europe, and I wrote a piece then that criticized NATO expansion. I said it was the worst possible U.S. policy, and I continued to take that position for the next 15 years. I hold to it today, that it was a terrible idea for the United States to push NATO expansion. It's an inconvenient fact, perhaps, that I am not actually part of the mainstream consensus on U.S. foreign policy. I criticize U.S. foreign policy 99% of the time, but occasionally, 1% of the time, I find some agreement with what the United States has done, and in this case, its support of Ukraine is one of those. Benjamin says that many of the things I said were not accurate. He didn't have time to provide the details. I'd be interested in seeing what those details are. He did mention 2 things that I said were inaccurate. Let me respond to those. One was that I said that Putin wants to destroy Ukraine, and that obviously the military campaign has not been saturation bombing to the extent that a country would be destroyed. But let me point out that I was not saying that he was interested in destroying the country. He wants to destroy the government, and he wants to destroy Ukraine's capacity to function as a country in the international community. It's very different. And it includes not just military, but a variety of other methods to undercut Ukraine. He said that I have characterized Putin as an imperialist. Actually, I was very careful not to use that term, imperialism, because I believe that what Putin is interested in is not reconstituting the Soviet Union, much less invading Eastern Europe. He's not stupid. He knows that he'd get his ass kicked if he tried to invade Eastern Europe. What he's interested in doing is creating an entirely different kind of relationship between Russia and the near abroad, Eastern Europe, and the European Union. It's not an imperialist strategy. It's not an attempt to create Lebensraum. It is Ruski Mir. Ruski Mir literally means Russian world. And by the way, that's Ruski Mir, not Rossiyski Mir. There's a difference in Russian between the two words. Ruski means ethnic Russian. Rossiyski means civilian Russian. In other words, you can be a Rossiyski in Russia and not be ethnically Russian. You can be Latvian, you can be Kazakh. If you're Ruski, you are ethnically Russian. It used to be that Vladimir Putin talked about Rossiyski this, Rossiyski that, because he was educated in the Soviet Union and he understood that it was a multi-ethnic federation. But he started to change the way he talked, roughly around 2013, around the time of the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine. And he started talking about Ruski this, and Ruski that, because he was no longer interested in defending Rossiyski, the kind of civic virtues of a multi-ethnic federation. He was interested in ethnic Russians and defending the rights of ethnic Russians. He had, in a sense, transformed himself into a Russian nationalist, which he hadn't been before. And this is a signal transformation in Russian and Putin's version of geopolitics. There were a couple of other things he said which were interesting, but let me just talk about NATO expansion for a moment. As an existential threat? Nah, that's not what Putin was worried about. What was the Euromaidan protests about? Was it about NATO membership? No. It was called the Euromaidan because it was about building a relationship between Ukraine and the European Union. It was about a stronger trade relationship, which Viktor Yanukovych, at the time, the Ukrainian leader, was not interested in because he wanted a stronger economic relationship with Russia. It was the threat that Ukraine would have a tighter relationship with Europe and all that Europe represented, as I said, international law, democracy, human rights, and the prospect that those values would take root in Russia as well. Because remember, there were plenty of protests during that period in Russia that were aimed at democratizing the country, that were opposed to Putin's rule. That's what Putin was worried about. He wasn't worried about NATO membership. He didn't raise much of a fuss when the Baltics entered NATO at the end of the 1990s. And he certainly didn't put up a fuss when Finland and Sweden entered NATO more recently. Why? Because he fundamentally doesn't care about NATO. He cares about the threat posed by European Union and European values. I think that's important to remember when there's this conversation about why Putin invaded Ukraine. He did so for ideological reasons, not out of some preemptive effort to prevent NATO from attacking him. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I just want to mention that since I met John Feffer 14 months ago, since we had the first panel discussion here 14 months ago, we've actually sat down at 2 restaurants and had coffee and discussed a lot of these details and argued and at least tried to negotiate our way towards some kind of common understanding of this war. Well, we haven't, but at least we've been working at it, and I'm hoping we can continue even after this. There's a lot that you said, John, that I wanted to respond to, but I'm going to wait and do that during the Q&A if I have the time in terms of your questions. But the more important things that I want to say are this. In one of his final and most important speeches, President Kennedy said in 1963 that regardless of how much we oppose the policies of the Soviets, we must learn to live with, negotiate, and cooperate with them on areas of our common security. If we don't, we risk our beloved children's and grandchildren's future to catastrophic nuclear war, whether started intentionally or by accident. And we risk their future to the climate emergency if we fail to stop it because of war and lack of international collaboration. Kennedy and our nation came perilously close to that brink during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, and there have been other close calls since then. And though it's not as apocalyptic as the climate emergency and nuclear war, there's a third serious risk of continuing this war. It is that Ukraine has suffered too much already. Actually, Ben just referred to that, so I'm going to skim over this really quickly. Estimates, President Zelensky just suggested 47,000. That was up from 31,000 about 3 weeks ago that I heard him say, dead soldiers in the Ukraine. Many more have been maimed for life. Russia has suffered significant losses too, but not nearly as many as the Ukrainians, and that's what Ben was saying. I'll skip over that. If this war goes on, Ukraine will lose an even greater number of its young and middle-aged men, as well as some women. Especially the U.S. pressures, U.S. pressures Ukraine to lower its draft age from the present 25 to 18, as Secretary of State Blinken recently called for. This will have a negative impact on the country's birth rate and its ability to rebuild its society and economy when the war ends. It will also lead, as all wars do, to big increases in crime, drug addiction, domestic violence, child abuse, and suicide from the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that will plague so many of the men who survive this war and those who marry and become fathers. This is why a recent Gallup poll in Ukraine found, recent, 2 weeks ago, found that 52% of Ukrainians are tired of this war and now support immediate negotiations to end it. This figure was only 37% a year ago. It's also why there are growing and disturbing accounts of Ukrainian men being kidnapped off the street and forced to serve in the army, and why the desertion rate is increasing, as well as men fleeing conscription by crossing the border at night. And here in the U.S., a new poll, very recent, by CBS News showed that over half of Americans want our policy to be less military support for Ukraine and negotiations to end the war. For all these reasons, I think it's urgent that the U.S. and NATO should stop arming Ukraine and urge it to negotiate the best deal it can get with Russia. Given the battlefield reality after nearly 3 years of the war, it will mean Ukraine will have to give up some of its territory in the Donbass and Crimea and agree to neutrality rather than join NATO. But if they keep fighting to try and defeat Russia, they'll just suffer the death and maiming of many more of their soldiers and the loss of even more of their territory, infrastructure, and the potential to even exist as an independent and economically viable nation. At the end of 2022, the Ukrainian army was successfully holding its own against the Russians. General Mark Milley, the head of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff at that time, expressed his view that Ukraine might be at its high water mark in this war, and that it should negotiate with the Russians a settlement from a position of relatively equal strength. But other Biden administration officials told him not to speak out this way any longer, and the Ukraine should continue to fight and win the war. If his views had been followed, approximately 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers would still be alive, and their country wouldn't be facing gradual defeat militarily and potential loss of much more territory. In the early 1980s, Western Massachusetts and Vermont activists, including myself, started the nuclear weapons freeze movement to stop the alarming and costly arms race with the then Soviet Union. It went viral, though we didn't use that term or have that technology back then, and found the country around the whole country, and led to 1 million people demonstrating in New York City in 1982. 42 years later, today, we've managed to survive what the real Albert Einstein and J. Robert Oppenheimer, not the actors in the blockbuster film last year, worried about and warned us about. But we still threaten ourselves and our world with nuclear weapons and a new arms race with Russia and China. For the sake of my children and grandchildren and yours, and for all children and all species on our fragile planet, I urge you to add your voice to stop this war before it leads to nuclear war, and to stop burning fossil fuels in wars like in Ukraine and like in Israel and Palestine, and in the overarching war on nature that's poisoning our sacred earth itself, before we go from climate emergency to climate catastrophe. Thank you. We're going back to in the order, unless you want to switch.
No, I'm getting mixed up.
Yeah, I know.
But I would suggest, because we're running out of time, I'm going to cede my 6 minutes. You can go next, and then we can take questions from the audience, and I can add whatever.
I'm not sure if everybody in the live stream can hear that, but John Feffer just gave over his 6 minutes right now, so we can get to more questions and Q&A. We did start later than I was anticipating. So Ben Abelo will take this last 6 minutes in this round, and then we'll open it up.
Well, again, I don't want to spend most of my time responding specifically to John, just as he didn't want to spend most of his time responding to me, but I do want to do what he did, which is also respond to a couple of points. The idea that there are no Nazis in Ukraine, this is a completely false idea. It's a mistaken idea that's based on the notion that the numerical and percentage of Nazis in Ukraine is low. First of all, it's not even quite correct to be speaking of Nazis. Nazis, fascist with a large F, as in Italian fascism, these are subcategories of a broader category that scholars call integral nationalism. And Ukrainian nationalism is understood to be a category within the category of integral nationalism. Details don't matter, but these are basically what people mean by fascist with a small f. And many of them did fight with the Nazis, and they killed, certainly, let's call it 80,000 Poles and Jews. Bandera, Shukevich, etc. But as far as Nazis right now, they have a small minority in terms of the voting population, but Nazis and fascists do not work by democratic means. They use coercive power, and they are armed and they are dangerous in Ukraine. And in fact, they exert what is sometimes referred to as a coercive veto over Ukrainian policy, both domestic and foreign. And I'll give you just one simple example. So Zelensky was inaugurated in, I forget, was it May or July? The dates I mix up, 2019. And in his inauguration speech, by the way, Zelensky had run on a platform of peace, a peace platform, and there were 70 independent peace-oriented groups operating in Ukraine at that point. And what they wanted to do was to validate the Minsk agreements, which had been signed in 2014 and 2015, but that the Ukrainian government was balking on signing, and which the Western governments, especially Germany and France, were not actively advocating and pushing for. But in any case, Zelensky, at his inaugural address, stated very publicly, he said that he wanted to make peace with Russia, and that he was willing to give up his position and even lose his place in the government if that was what was required to make peace with Russia. Now, 1 week later, the man who was in charge then of the group called the Right Sector, which was the violent group that was especially involved in the Maidan events of 2014, in a written interview, and I can point you to the actual quote if you want to see it, He said, Zelensky says that he is willing to give up his position. No, he will give up his life. He will hang from a tree on the main street of Ukraine and main street of Kiev. This was the beginning of a reversal in Zelensky's position. By the way, the person who made that threat never faced any retaliation from the government. There was never any attempt to convict him of a crime. This was the beginning of a downward slide in Zelensky's policies by which he basically capitulated to the fascist far right within Ukraine. Now, the word capitulated, that's not my word. That's the word of the Ukrainian-Canadian scholar Ivan Kachanovsky. And I can point you to his work on the Maidan. He's probably the most single knowledgeable person about the internal dynamics of the Maidan massacre that occurred and other aspects of the Maidan. But in any case, the situation inside Ukraine is very different from the one we usually hear. Keep in mind right now that Ukraine, there is no free press. Opposition parties have been banned. The Russian Orthodox Church has been banned. And this banning, by the way, started taking place well before the Russian invasion in 2022. So we are not dealing here with what we would call a democratic society. We're dealing with a society that's struggling with deep internal corruption, with a fascist far right that currently exerts a coercive veto over Ukrainian policy. There's a lot more to say about all this stuff. I'm happy to talk more about Maidan and Euromaidan and the violent coup that popular protest culminated in, and other features such as that, on the notion that Putin was trying to destroy Ukraine as a functioning society. Well, that's a complicated one, but we'll have to talk about that. He only wished to destroy Ukraine as a functioning society. It's not even clear he wants to do that now, but this is something that the political scientist John Mearsheimer has warned about since 2014. He said that if the West keeps pushing for Ukraine to join NATO, then Putin is going to be left with only one choice, which is to try to destroy Ukraine. If we reach the point where Ukraine does get destroyed as a functioning society, it's precisely because the internal dynamics in Ukraine and within the West made it impossible for Ukraine to declare neutrality with respect to NATO. All right. I don't know a lot of time, so I'm going to make just two brief quotations here. John also pointed out that certain countries have joined NATO, and Putin didn't seem too upset about that, and that's accurate. Different countries have greater levels of concern, but Ukraine has been from the get-go the primary country that Russia is most concerned about joining NATO. And I'll read you a quote here from William Byrne from 2008. This was a confidential email sent to Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State. William Byrne was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. He's now currently the director of the CIA. This is what he wrote to Condoleezza Rice. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just for Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle-draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. By the way, keep in mind that Ukraine was the launchpad through which the Nazis attacked Russia and the Soviet Union during World War II, leading to the death of 25 million Russians and 25 million Soviets, including 12.5 million Russians, 13% of the entire population. Not 13% of the military, 13% of the entire population of Russia was destroyed through an attack launched through Ukraine. This was the siege of Stalingrad. I'd love to read a quote to you later from the National Intelligence Council, the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2008, which basically predicted not only the taking of Crimea, but the invasion of Ukraine in response to attempts to push Ukraine into NATO.
Thank you, Ben. That ends the 2 rounds of our presentations. Priya, you're going to pass the mic around, correct? Yep. Librarian Priya Cherry will take this microphone and offer it to whoever wants to ask a question or make a comment. Remember the 45-second limit so we can get around to everybody. Who would like to ask the first question or make the first comment to any of us, or just about your views about the issue? I see a hand over there.
Okay, and as I'm coming over, folks at home, if you have a question, feel free to email it to reference@forbeslibrary.org. I'll check that before we wrap up today.
I have a lot of questions, but one that comes to mind foremost is nobody likes war. It certainly isn't really profitable. But in making peace at the present time, what makes you think Russia is going to honor a peace? They had the Budapest memorandum in 1994 that Russia agreed with the United States that if Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, that they would look after the Ukraine. They said Ukraine was not supposed to threaten nuclear war, and Russia agreed to the borders at that time.
I think we really understand that. Good question. If you could give that microphone to Priya so we could respond to it.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
All right.
The microphone goes back to the librarian.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And John, if you'd like to have a seat, you're welcome to. The camera's focused right on you guys there.
I forgot about that.
So, that's okay.
And which one of us in either of these mics?
The mics works great.
Anybody like to a brief 1 minute max response to the gentleman's question?
Sure. You know, is this on? Test.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. So as far as the Budapest Memorandum, you need to keep in mind that all these agreements, it wasn't a formal treaty, but, it's still an agreement, are made in a certain context. Now, you have to keep in mind that in that context, the West had agreed to not expand NATO east of the Elbe River in Germany. This was a multiply attested assurances that were given not only by the United States, but by Germany and by Britain. And there's extensive documentation of this. So the setting in which the Budapest Memorandum was given was part of a context where the West had agreed not to expand NATO. And they broke that promise multiply in 1999, in 2004, and 2008. So, I'm not in favor of breaking agreements under any context, but you have to understand that there was a whole setting to this where Russia felt that they had been deceived and lied to. And not just there. There was also the Minsk Agreement, which these are accords that were signed by Germany, by Ukraine, by Germany, by France. I'm trying to think if Russia actually signed. I think they were more an observer. The U.S. was an observer, and it was validated by the UN. This was to make peace in the Donbass, and it was the West specifically and Ukraine that violated that agreement. That was in 2008. So there were a lot of violations that occurred not by Russia before Russia did what is usually perceived as violating the Budapest Memorandum.
Thank you, Ben. John, you want to take a crack at that question before we get another one?
It's an easy one. That agreed to. Trump would do the same thing he did with the Taliban. There were assurances that the Taliban would prevent terrorist attacks within Afghanistan. They would do a variety of different things. There were no mechanisms to ensure that the Taliban would comply with that, and they didn't. So that's likely would happen in the situation with Russia. As for the extensive documentation about assurances that the presumably was the one who received those assurances, has said, actually, no, we were not promised that NATO would not expand. Now, mind you, I'm saying this as someone who opposed NATO expansion. I was opposing NATO expansion at every point along the way. But we've got to tell the truth. There is no documentation, certainly none on paper, about those assurances.
Thank you, John. Let's go on. We don't have a lot of time. Let's go on to the next question or comment. Front row.
Okay. I'm thinking, regardless of why the war started, it seems like what's happening now is U.S. military aid is just pouring gas on the flames, just continuing, allowing the war to continue indefinitely. And I was just thinking, well, what would have happened if the U.S., when we invaded Iraq, what would have happened if the Russians and the Europeans had supplied countless weapons and support to the other side, to the Ba'ath Party, to Saddam Hussein? It would have continued indefinitely, the war, impossibly. It was a war of occupation at that time. And that's, so it's not good for the people of Ukraine, no matter how you look at it, for the war to continue. And the U.S. military aid, stopping the military aid is the only way the war is going to stop. Because it seems like every time you turn around, they're talking about, Ukraine can maybe advance here or there, but it never happens. It's just basically a stalemate. The Russians are winning a little bit, but the bottom line is to stop the U.S. military aid.
Thank you for that one. Who'd like to take the first crack at that? I was so busy listening to it, I'm not ready to take a crack at it. Okay. One of you.
The reason the war continues is because Russia keeps fighting it. That's the bottom line. And your assumption is that if U.S. would stop military aid, that the alternative would be a peace. That wouldn't necessarily be the alternative. The alternative would be occupation and extermination. Why do you think that we have seen genocides and horrific events take place around the world? That often has been the real life alternative to the absence of resistance, the absence of a just force that has prevented occupiers with malign intentions of achieving their objectives. So the whole notion that you have in the back of your mind that there is a lovely peace out there that's going to descend upon Ukraine as soon as the U.S. stops military aid, or Europe stops military aid, or Ukrainians lay down their arms, there's no reason to assume that that is going to take place. Much more reasonable to assume that Russia does what it has already done throughout Ukraine, and that is kill people and imprison people and do other war crimes.
Oh, no, excuse me. Wait, Rich, that would be a second turn. And then let me check with the other people in the audience. No, just a moment. I'll come back to you. But there may be other people and time is short.
I want to respond also.
Yeah, okay, I'll respond. So if there are any other questions, please, somebody else can go. Otherwise, we come back.
Yeah. John is saying we have no reason to, that basically Putin wants to keep going, and that he always wanted to keep going. Most people don't realize that Putin actually approached Zelensky's office within 24 hours of the invasion. I stated before that the entire invasion was an attempt at coercive diplomacy to force Ukraine to accept neutrality, which the West and Ukraine were not accepting before the invasion. Within 24 hours, on February 25th, Putin's office approached Zelensky's office and offered the beginning of negotiation for peace in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality, with a return of all territory. It was only within 24 hours. There wasn't a lot of territory taken, but with a return of all territory to the status quo antebellum, that is, to where the borders were drawn before the February 24th invasion. And that was in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality. Then there were sets of, by the way, that was sabotaged by the West. That initial interaction was sabotaged by the State Department, and we have, I can provide links on this as well. Then we had new negotiations that started directly between, I'm talking about your negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. They wanted to make peace in exchange for neutrality. There were negotiations that took place in Belarus, first in person. Then we had intermediaries with both Naftali Bennett, the ex-Prime Minister of Israel, and Gerhard Schroeder, the ex-Chancellor of Germany, were involved. And then there were extensive negotiations in Istanbul. All of these were broken up by the U.S. So there's every reason to think, and we've seen evidence of this from day one of the war, that Russia wanted to negotiate peace in exchange for Ukrainian neutrality, and if anything, it was the West that broke this all up, and it's the West that seems to be untrustworthy in this case.
Thank you, Ben. Other comments or questions? Somebody who hasn't had a chance yet?
There is a question that
don't-
came in through the
And we
email.
have 5 minutes?
We've got about 5 minutes, yes. There's a question that came in through email from someone watching from home, if it's okay if I read that. Okay. Quote, I've watched the YouTube channel Russian Media Monitor, and it has Russians discussing these issues. The participants often call for the total destruction of Ukraine and its Western allies. Are these mainstream media personalities expressing the Russian government's position, or are they just trying to entertain viewers? Unquote.
Thank you to the person watching on the live stream who sent that question in. Take a crack at it.
I mean, well, first of all, the notion that Russia's only interested in neutrality is erroneous. I mean, in those negotiations you were talking about, neutrality was not the only thing that was on the table. You fail to look at actually what Russian government statements are, what Putin actually says his war aims are. And that includes denazification, which requires not the destruction of the country as a whole, as I said, the destruction of the current government. And when I said that there were no Nazis, I said there were no Nazis in the government. I didn't say there were no Nazis in the country. There are some fascists, and there is, as you point out, one sector which has absolutely no political support at this point, and certainly does not hold a veto power over the Zelensky government. So those comments that the person online has heard, they reflect, I think, some genuine feelings on the part of Russian citizens, perhaps some of the, and there is a strong fascist movement in Russia itself, reflect fascist sentiments inside Russia. Again, I believe that Putin is more strategic about his ambitions and his aims, and it's about neutralizing the government, not neutrality per se, but ensuring that Ukraine has no functioning power in the international community.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Well, Russia's concern is not to have a Western military bulwark on its border operating through Ukraine. I mean, imagine how the U.S. would react in a shoe is on the other foot sort of circumstance. Reverse the situation. Imagine that Russia or China forms an alliance on our border with Canada or with Mexico. And then imagine that they start carrying out military exercises on our border, including practicing firing missiles to destroy targets inside the U.S., which, by the way, NATO has done right on Russia's border from Estonia. The U.S. would go to war right off the bat. As far as the question of what went on in Istanbul, I will tell you that the chief Ukrainian negotiator, David Arakamian, and a close aide of Zelensky, who was also on the negotiating team, which is Alexei Arestovich, both stated that they thought that the negotiations would have been successful, and in fact, one of them actually said in an interview that they were starting to take out the champagne bottles. Now, this negotiation was then broken off by when Boris Johnson showed up in Kiev.
Thank you, Ben. We have 2 minutes left. I don't see any of their hands. We'll have the last. Oh, there is one, or is that two? I'm going to suggest to this gentleman in the front, when we adjourn this meeting in 2 minutes, you can come up and ask one of the, your follow-up question. But let's go to the last question in the back row.
Yes. Is it in the Ukraine Constitution that the government is responsible for the gene pool of the country?
I wasn't totally clear what you said. Were you?
Yeah, can you clarify a little more?
Is in the Constitution of Ukraine, is there a portion where it says the government is responsible for the gene pool of the country?
I've never heard of such a thing, but I can't swear there's nothing like that, but I think I would have heard of it if it existed, but.
Maybe informally, if you can stay an extra minute or two just as we're going out, maybe we could address that question. But we do need to stop now to honor this wonderful library that has hosted us for the third time in 14 months. Thank you, Priya Chari, Adult Services. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for watching the live stream. It will be recorded and soon on the Forbes Library website. If you want to encourage other people to watch it. Thank you all.